My first feeling on being invited was that I want to speak something about buildings. And not really from the direction of architectural design, but maybe through the work of a few contemporary artists, and really thinking about the building more as a place where narratives get stored, where history might accumulate. And Adam spoke about how we leave our exhaust onto the digital domain as we move. And I was just thinking of the kind of exhaust we leave within spaces when we inhabit them, and how perhaps by just adding something into a space or taking something away from that space, one might either encode that space with some meaning, or perhaps derive a meaning that existed but was hitherto invisible. Most of these images that I might show might be familiar to a lot of you, and they could also be described variously as pieces which are photo works or sculptures or installations within either an art space or within a public space. But I might just stay with the idea of the building at the back of them while we kind of just look at them in the context of the larger conversations we've been having. And of course, the fact that Americans describe the word story as S-T-O-R-Y also made me think of the fact that these are stacks of narratives that one might encounter. But let me begin with Rachel Whiteread's house. In the sort of early 90s, a lot of the houses in the East End, these terraced houses, were being demolished. And the last one to kind of be demolished sort of outlasted itself to become a sculpture. And but with the house itself becoming the mold, but the private space inhabited by the people in the house then becoming sort of a concrete sculpture. So the house is kind of cast from within, so the windows then become protrusions, and you see sort of fire spaces, and perhaps through this outlasting in a new form, maybe kind of speaking back to a kind of demised neighborhood as a temporary sort of public sculpture. From house, I thought we could move to home, which is this Korean artist Do Ho-se's work. Do Ho-se lives between the US and Korea, and in fact, in some ways, bridges this distance, or even the leaving from home, through the remaking of his own sort of personal space. This is a two-scaled recreation of his home, but through this kind of curtain material which can fold up, become part of a suitcase, and then open up again as an apartment, or in this case, his home in Korea. This work is called work number 850, and it's Martin Creed's work, the British artist Martin Creed. And the work is essentially a dashing runner who cuts through the Duveen galleries of Tate Britain at very, very high speed. And there's a gap of 30 seconds before the next runner comes along, and then the next one arrives. And in a sense, through this sort of whipping gesture, perhaps moving the air in this grand neoclassical building, and also altering the sort of customary pace of that building. But equally, through this gesture, perhaps casting something on to the recurrence of the human body in the adjacent galleries of the Tate Britain collection. And again, through actually encountering it in that space, perhaps this runner could be equally on Millbank Road outside, or the Hyde Park, and thus perforating this architecture, this neoclassical architecture, almost bringing the street through an action. This is yet another Tate project. This is at the Tate Modern and the projects within the Turbine Hall. This is Olafur Eliasson's The Weather Project, where the already massive space of the Turbine Hall gets doubled because the roof and the ceiling becomes a mirror, and thus doubling the entire space. And also there's a kind of artificial mist that kind of softens the entire environment, within which several hundred bulbs form this sun. Also a space doubling and then embracing a sun within its own space, offering the kind of sun-loving, sun-starved Londoner a permanently installed sun within the space of a museum to kind of bask under. This is yet another piece in that same space. This is Doris Salcedo's Sibboleth, and a piece I greatly admire and love, where the artwork takes the form of a kind of subterranean chasm, almost like as if the Tate has now been visited by a natural calamity or an earthquake, as if the artwork itself is a fault line or a wound within this large building. But equally, it could be a drawing on the floor. It could be an etching in the floor. This is the same space of the Turbine Hall, but vastly rescaled to fit a smaller room on the second floor of the Tate Modern itself, in the work of Roman Ondak. So you kind of climb a little ramp and you kind of enter a smaller space, which is exactly the replica of the space below. And this Lilliputian sense of self that you have to endure as you kind of enter this vast space and you enter the building gets completely reoriented when you sort of enter this other space where perhaps the body of another viewer becomes this kind of upscaled, massive, monumental, giant figure. This is Maurizio Catalan's The Lift. This is Chinese artist Ai Weiwei, Study in Perspective. I also thought we might look at Anish Kapoor's Swayam, which was part of his exhibition at the Royal Academy, where this massive 30-ton locomotive, which is essentially like a pile of pigment, travels slowly from one end of the Royal Academy to the other. In some sense, kind of rubbing through the arches and also kind of sullying this doorway repeatedly, and in doing so perhaps evocative of many things, such as maybe bodily evocations of throat, alimentary canal, the scatological, but also the sensuous and the sexual, and a kind of penetrative relationship with the arches, and maybe even perhaps gendering this space in a kind of feminine sort of form. These are two pavilions within the 2009 Venice Biennale by the Danish artist duo Elmgren and Draxet. And the pavilions, for those of you who may be unfamiliar, are essentially spaces that nations inhabit briefly in the context of the Venice Biennale, showing the work from that country. But in these instances, the two pavilions become domestic spaces, one in which you encounter bachelors, youngsters hanging out, reading, in an environment which has a collection of design and contemporary art, but also perhaps the owner of the house face down, floating in the water, as if some occurrences have taken place here that one is not completely familiar with. And so you kind of break into a domestic environment to kind of walk through this Nordic pavilion, which is the adjacent house, to this other house, which is also part of the same artwork called Collectors, that you can enter, and what looks like a family home, but it looks like there's been some uncanny activities here. And the person narrating these stories is somebody who tells you stories, but also in the form of a sales pitch. And you see a kind of dissolving of a pavilion into real estate. This is Frank Lloyd Wright's, of course, the Guggenheim, and the Rotunda that we're also familiar with. But it gets completely emptied recently in the work of Tino Segal. Of course, these are pictures which are illicit pictures. He doesn't allow documentation, but these have been found on Flickr, and I thought they could arrive since they're already in the public domain. So you kind of enter a ramp where a young girl or boy might meet you, asking you what is progress, and engage you in a sort of conversation slowly taking you up the ramp and handing you over to a slightly more grown-up person, and then an adolescent, a teenager, and maybe a middle-aged person. And as you kind of move the ramp in conversation with them, you are taken through this whole idea of progress and life, but left at the top of the rotunda to then walk back through this empty Frank Lloyd Wright building. And it was interesting to really see how this piece of architecture that has always been an interesting battle between curators and artists and the architecture itself, then gets completely reinscribed with another kind of possibility, another kind of possibility to read stories or tell stories or think stories. This was a recent work of mine called Public Notice 3, and was shown at the Art Institute of Chicago between September 11th, 2010 to 2011. And it's a speech that was delivered on September 11th, but 1893. And it's a speech that I've been very interested in because the context of the speech was the first Parliament of Religions. On the very day, separated by 108 years, we had events which completely stood on the other end of the context of this conversation. So the speech was delivered by Swami Vivekananda, calling for a death of fanaticism, end of fundamentalism, intolerance, all the themes that in some ways became part of our daily dialogue post 9/11/2001. But it was interesting to look at both these dates together. But what was interesting as a possibility with Public Notice 3 was to kind of restage the same speech within the very site that it was delivered in. In 1893, the very building of the Art Institute was essentially an auditorium where this speech was delivered. The work kind of, the same words are split in the 5 colors that the US Homeland Security has marked as threat levels. So post 9/11, every day there was a new threat code that you could look up, and the coding system told you that it's either red or orange, and it never went down below yellow, which means every day there was a heightened sense of threat that was constantly being played out at everyone. And so the speech kind of is refracted through this text. You read the text as you ascend, but as you descend, you step on these sort of films of light. What was also interesting within the Art Institute of Chicago was that the grand staircase stood in the middle of all these corridors. Whether you want to go to the European modernism corridor or the South Asian corridor, you actually pass through the space of this text to look at these words through the, so this is how it appeared in 1893. So you actually reread the text in the very site where these words were initially heard. And as you kind of exit from certain sight lines, you actually see them through these different artifacts from different places around the world. And thank you.
Thank you, Jitish. It's great to get to see some inspiring contemporary art in the midst of all of this design that we've been seeing. Just a couple of quick questions, because I don't think we have too much time left. When you take art out of the white cube context and you put it into a building which already has history, culture, monumentality almost built into it, is that something which is exciting for an artist? Is that a challenge? Is that something you look forward to working with yourself as an art practice?
You know, I mean, with Public Notice, I mean, this is a speech that I've sort of engaged with for almost a decade prior to this, and it's been shown in various contexts in different ways. But coming back into the site where it was spoken, where essentially not just this overlay of dates, but the overlay of the very site and of the memory of that building, I think definitely added to a heightened potency in terms of how one might read these very words. So, so yes, I mean, often the context in which you make or place a work can widely alter the way the piece is read and the kind of things it throws back at you when you do that.
But is the process of that, because as you mentioned in your talk that, you know, there's always curators, now you've got an architect to deal with, omnipresent or present, it doesn't matter. Is that something which leads to a new mix of design, architecture, and art? How does one draw a line between the three kind of vocabularies, and how does one make them mesh? Is it seamless? Is it very distinct? What's your experience been?
I think what we are seeing more and more is the dissolving of these categories. So I don't think we need to sort of draw back lines again. But I was interested in what Kareem was saying this morning, that, and of course he used the word selfish, but I think when you make art, and that might be a separation between design and art in some way, in a very sort of obvious way, this might be the separation, that when you make art, you essentially, in some ways, going back to things that you don't know and you want to find out. And when you get these things together into a piece of work, they might possibly not mean anything at that point of time. They might not mean anything for a large duration of time. And whereas if you set out to make a building, it has to be occupied. It has to be. So in a sense, and I think design might call for a certain kind of empathy at the point of making, because it also, in some ways, imagines a user. Whereas when you make art, you might do really well blanking off the notion of somebody who is looking at it, at least while you're thinking about it. So I think the processes get reversed in some ways, while there might be other similarities as well. So it's hard to draw lines, but if there's one line to draw, it's possibly this difference in the way the gesture happens when you make it.
But to pick up with what you said, now there is this kind of cross-fertilization of ideas which happens. So there is almost the architect as a sculptor, and we have examples of that in Bilbao. And within the art world, there is this kind of conversation which happens of the star architect who creates these fabulous but complicated buildings, and how does sculpture fit into them. So in the Bilbao Frangeri, there are curved walls, and there are large spaces which have a character of their own. And for installations to work within that is not always easy. I mean, they really need to have a presence to be able to compete almost with the architecture.
I mean, yeah, that's a conversation that's been ongoing in some ways in a lot of our minds when we think of the way art is going. But I think it's also interesting to think of, say, Doris Salcedo's work, where confronted by this really large space, as opposed to a desire to put something in, it's an etching in the floor. And I think there are also other mechanisms through which, in some ways, that sense of scale might open up possibilities to think of something far more deeply hidden in that space, And maybe it's not really a battle with the architecture, but perhaps sort of staying there and maybe capturing an aura within that architecture through gestures, which might be quite contrarian to the invitation, in a sense, by the architecture.
Okay, thank you. I think our time is up. Thank you.
Thank you.